Je voudrais commencer par remercier les organisateurs pour l'invitation et particulièrement notre collègue et ami Philippe de Breuker. Je me souviens de la naissance du réseau Odysseus il y a bientôt 20 ans et me suis réjoui de l'évolution de ses activités au fil des années. Je salue votre travail collectif, votre remarquable travail collectif d'éducation et de conscientisation au sort et aux droits des migrants et des réfugiés. As we have seen with the State of the Union speech of the American president 2 days ago, nationalist populist politicians established a dominant narrative, saying that migrants steal jobs, siphon off social budgets, create insecurity, or change our values. They do so with total impunity, despite the fact that all these assertions have been proven mostly wrong by social sciences. Mainstream politicians are not taking the electoral risk of picking a fight in favor of persons who are politically non-existent, with the exception of the US, due to the size of the 30 million strong Hispanic electorate. In effect, in most countries, there's no coherent, sophisticated, multi-layered, positive narrative on migrants, on mobility, on diversity, which mainstream politicians, left and right, could use to convince electors and win elections. I fear that Europe will endure a long stretch of brutal nationalist populist policies, which will indeed reduce the number of undesirable migrants, but will miserably fail at reducing or even managing the migration pressure. Europeans will need to realize that they need a different approach to mobility and diversity. Let us start with the roadblocks before coming to future perspectives in 6 points. We're facing 2 structural roadblocks on our road to human rights protection for all, including migrants. The strategies of deterrence and externalization will cost us enormously and fail ultimately at changing the migration dynamics. A new vision will have to be developed, and the Global Compact can be the stepping stone to this change in perspective. First, electoral democracies do not know how to represent migrants. Human rights struggles have been mostly won based on the political claim to equal citizenship. Industrial workers, women, indigenous peoples, detainees, gays and lesbians, persons with disabilities have wrestled their rights out of the hands of the powers that be through political struggles and legal actions. When we mobilize publicly, politicians pay attention and change their language, their behavior, their conceptions. This, in turn, contributes to altering the perceptions of the electorate and reducing the stereotypes and fantasies that previously dominated public debates. Migrants will not mobilize publicly anytime soon. The right to vote and be elected is reserved, even in international human rights law, to citizens. We are facing a structural limitation of our present conception of electoral democracy. If one is not represented, one's rights are not respected, protected, and promoted in the electoral system. No taxation without representation, said the American Revolution. Most migrants respect the law and pay taxes and yet aren't represented. In time, we shall have to think about providing voting rights to all authorized residents, since they all pay taxes and obey the law. This is not for tomorrow, although I've heard that Scotland is thinking about it. Second roadblock. While globalization has enhanced the delocalization of production to developing countries where labor is cheap and workers' protection standards low, such delocalization is not possible for large sectors of our economy, such as agriculture, construction, hospitality, caregiving, domestic work, fisheries, and extraction. These are local industries. Destination countries have thus tolerated or even constructed on their own territory production conditions similar to those in developing countries, with a view to subsidizing these sectors through the reduction of labor costs. I have met undocumented sub-Saharan agricultural workers in Italy who were paid 20 euros for a day of 10 hours of work in the fields, 2 or 3 times a week. temporary low-wage workers with a very precarious status, like single employer sponsorship mechanisms or kafala systems, and undocumented migrants form a pliable workforce for these sectors of the economy, sectors which would not be profitable in an open and regulated labor market in which citizens would request much better conditions for the same tasks. The repression of undocumented migration increases the precariousness of both categories by enhancing the fear factor and thus silencing them. These migrants occupy, in our societies, the ecological niche of early industrial workers, indentured laborers, medieval serfs, and slaves of previous eras. We often say that migrants do jobs that citizens will not do. The reality is that citizens will not do those jobs at the conditions that migrants are forced to accept. If you offer 30 euros per hour to work in the fields, you would have a lot of citizens going for that. Imagine the price of tomatoes. Millions of European employers are calling for such cheap labor, despite what the politicians are telling us about needing only highly skilled migrants. Unless we recognize our real labor needs in such sectors and regulate such labor markets to provide equal and effective labor protections to all workers, regardless of status, unless we empower all workers, regardless of status, to fight for their human and labor rights on an equal footing, and unless we repress the employers who exploit workers, regardless of status, the hidden exploitation subsidy will continue to operate. Migrants will be at the same time exploited and accused of stealing jobs, and the pull factor of undocumented migration will remain strong, thus fueling and subsidizing migrant smuggling operations. Deterrence and prohibition. Migrants move due to push and pull factors. The push factors are well known: poverty and violence in the countries of origin. The pull factors are almost never discussed. All migrants, including refugees, mostly try to go to where there are jobs, where they can start integrating and creating a future for themselves and their children. And as I've said, destination countries have jobs for migrants in the official or the underground labor markets of dynamic, open, and diverse cities. Migrants are responding to the opportunities of such labor markets and would not come otherwise. Now, if you have push and pull factors and you put a barrier between them, prohibiting mobility but responding neither to the need to leave nor to the need to hire, you create perfect conditions for underground labor markets and smuggling markets to flourish. Without regular migration channels for refugees and much needed low-wage migrants, prohibitions and repressive policies only entrench and subsidize smuggling operations and underground labor markets. Prohibition is part of the problem, not of the solution. This was the case for the Prohibition era in America, when it took American authorities 13 years to figure out that legalization, regulation, and taxation of alcohol was much more cost-effective and life-saving than prohibition. We are slowly going in the same direction in the present war on drugs, thanks to safe injection sites and the legalization of marijuana. My Prime Minister promised it for next July. We'll see what happens. On migration issues, as for the regulation of drugs and alcohol, we must choose the path of harm reduction policies rather than that of harmful zero-tolerance policies. We know Einstein's definition of insanity, and we therefore need to legalize, regulate, and tax mobility rather than prohibit it. The only way to actually reduce migrant smuggling and unethical recruiting is to take over the mobility market from the hands of the smugglers and exploitative recruiters by offering regular, safe, accessible, and affordable mobility solutions in the form of visas or visa-free travel opportunities, with all the identity and security checks that efficient visa regimes can provide. The idea voiced by a British think tank this week that EU migrants' visas should be, and I quote, should be for those working antisocial hours, seems to me utterly unworkable, since it does not respond to the needs of British employers who want the exploitative cheap labor. Externalization of migration controls under the prohibition paradigm does not respond to mobility needs nor to labor market shortages. The premise that transit countries will voluntarily create and sustain a migration problem for themselves in order to help richer countries responsible for attracting those migrants to their labor markets in the first place has not proven workable until now, unless geography helps. The EU-Turkey statement fails to convince and has increased considerably the number of deaths at sea. The numbers are down. The numbers are down. We returned to what was seen as a crisis in 2013, 200,000, 250,000. The EU-Libya and Italy-Libya arrangements have provoked such an increase in the violation of the rights of migrants in Libya that the slavery-like detention conditions, although long documented, we've known that for over a decade, were suddenly all over the media. And I shall come back to externalization this afternoon. We need to change tack. The global north, including Europe, has the capacity to integrate millions of migrants and refugees, but it is facing a crisis of moral and political leadership. Unfortunately, one cannot get out of a crisis unless one provides a post-crisis vision and positive narrative. Remember Roosevelt's New Deal and the Marshall Plan. There will be no tackling the present migration crisis in Europe and elsewhere until politicians delineate a long-term, sustainable, human rights-based, strategic, mobility and diversity policy vision that will give meaning and direction to the actions presently taken. We need to change our collective mindset and accept that migrants will come no matter what because of the push and pull factors. And the goal should therefore be that most migrants will be using official channels to enter and stay and leave host countries, and to ensure a level playing field for all workers, regardless of status. Two axes will be key. One, recognizing our own real labor needs at all skills levels and opening up considerably more visa opportunities or visa-free travel programs. And secondly, developing refugee resettlement programs to serve considerably more refugees than the present 1%. Private sponsorship will be part of that. With proper selection and coordination, the numbers would be entirely manageable. After the 2005 EU enlargement, 1.5 million Central Europeans came to the UK and Ireland because these were the only countries that were open to them, and made a great economic contribution. When the crisis struck in 2009, many left the UK to go back home or elsewhere in the EU. Despite the Brexit rhetoric, this is a mobility to be celebrated, which matches labor needs and individual skills. We should want it not only between the cities of our countries or within regional areas such as the EU, but also planet-wide as a longer-term objective. Such facilitated mobility would have obvious advantages, as it would reduce significantly the market for smugglers, allow for most security checks by intelligence agencies to be made beforehand and abroad, reduce considerably the workload of refugee status determination systems in destination countries. If you have another way of accessing the territory, you don't need to ask for refugee status. This has been the case for the longest time before the 80s. And finally, and most importantly, I would say, provide the opportunity to show the electorate of destination countries that borders are respected, that authorities are managing this migration properly, that there's no chaos on the beach, as we've seen in the past, that reception mechanisms are in place, employers are integrating migrants in the labor market, investments have been made in integration programs, migrants are contributing enormously to the vitality of our societies, and therefore that the fear-mongering discourse of nationalist populist politicians is based on stereotypes, myths, and fantasies. This type of mobility is not science fiction. In the 50s and 60s, millions of North Africans and Turks entered Europe either without a visa or with an easily obtainable visitor's visa, which they changed into a work permit as soon as they found a job. There was almost no market for smuggling. No one died in the Mediterranean. Yet IDs and travel documents were checked and controlled at every border. There was no free movement then. Integration was indeed not part of the plan, and that was the failure. But migration was governed and security was ensured. The idea is therefore not to diminish border controls. On the contrary, it is to increase them and make them more effective by offering most foreigners easier access to appropriate travel documents, such as refugee resettlement visas, visitor visas, family reunification visas, work visas, resident visas, retiree visas, student visas. We provide states with the information they need and allow them to concentrate their intelligence and deterrence efforts on the minute percentage of foreigners who actually need to be excluded. We can set ourselves the goal of achieving this mobility within a generation, say a quarter century, through the progressive expansion of visa liberalization, visa facilitation regimes with benchmarks along the way. Such a strategy will also command long-term investments in diversity and integration policies, education strategies, providing migrants with tools of empowerment, access to justice, and support for the fight against marginalization and discrimination that fuel disenfranchisement. This is not a utopian solution. I would argue that utopia is on the sides of those who proclaim that migration can be stopped, that we can continue to live peacefully with millions of disenfranchised migrant youths, or that we can deport millions of migrants and seal the borders while respecting human rights. That's utopia or dystopia. Responding to the complexity of human mobility, states need to develop long-term strategic vision of how their mobility policies will look like in a generation from now, with precise timelines and accountability benchmarks. States do this strategic planning for most policies, including energy, environmental, public transit, infrastructure, food security, industrial policies, just to name a few, in order to determine the investments needed to achieve the objectives. Why are we not doing it for mobility, which is always now? We need to stop migration now. We need Indian IT workers now. Why not plan that over 25 years, over 50 years? In Target 10.7 of Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, states agreed to, and I quote, facilitate migration and mobility in the next 15 years. Facilitating means making migration easier, lowering barriers to mobility. It does not mean open borders or absolute free movement. It means developing many more creative, regular avenues for all migrants and refugees. We are not faced with the populist choice between open borders and the survival of the Western civilization. That's a misconception. We are facing our responsibility to properly govern migration, thus responding both to the mobility needs of the human population and the labor market needs of many globalized cosmopolitan cities, north and south. The Global Compact on Migration, which will start to be negotiated this month in New York, starting with the zero draft, which will be made public on Monday, next Monday, the 5th of February, offers us the opportunity to establish a framework leading to better global migration governance. And considering the reluctance of many states faced with populist nationalist movements, the Global Compact risks being a baby step. But it will be a step forward, and it will be a first step. The Global Compact will not be the end of the process, but only its beginning. Global migration governance will take a generation to shape up. There will be an aftermath to the present nationalist populist era we're mired into. If Europe acknowledged its real labor needs and started initiating a new public discourse about human mobility and diversity, their benefits and their challenges. It could be, with its human rights framework and its free movement experience, at the forefront of changing the way we perceive and treat migrants, thus exercising political, legal, and moral leadership in making mobility governance a success. I thank you for your kind attention.